will assume that that's an affirmative.
Yep, we're good.
Okay. Okay. So, hey guys, thank you for inviting me to this little get together. I'm actually kind of excited to be here. So, um, I'm going to talk a little bit about my personal axioms for game development. These are uh, the rules of thumb that I've developed over. It's actually I'm sneaking up on 40 years making games, which is really kind of frightening because games haven't been around much longer than that. Um, and most of these lessons were learned through making one mistake or another. So of course they stuck because, as we all know, pain is instructive. So let me first let me introduce myself. Um, my name is Scot Bayless, and I'm a game guy. I've been making games since the middle of the '80s. Um, the the games I worked on initially were role playing games back in the early days of Dungeons and Dragons on PC, and then I graduated into simulations, which was similar to some of the work I'd done in the defense business before that. Worked on Falcon 3.0, ran the simulation group at Microsoft for many years, actually helped launch the original Xbox, and then made a couple of fairly high profile games, including Everything or Nothing at Electronic Arts. And of course, had the pleasure of working with Ed Boon on Mortal Kombat and the privilege of rebooting Devil May Cry when I was at Capcom. Which was an interesting experience. It's a beloved franchise, and one of the lessons I learned from that is that it can be very tricky doing a reboot on a franchise that is so closely held by so many people. So I'm just going to walk you through some of the more important lessons that I think I've learned from my time in the game biz as an engineer, as a creative, as a producer, and as an executive. And I'll start with the observation that games are crafted, they're not hatched. Games don't appear out of thin air when somebody has a brilliant idea. Games are made very much the way any other kind of creative endeavor gets done. And in fact, this is actually one of my favorite little tidbits of trivia. Kate Sanborne is actually the originator of the famous line that was attributed to Thomas Edison. Genius is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. She was an educator in the 1890s, and she was the one who actually came up with that line. Edison usurped it a few years later and made it famous. But whoever came up with it, they were right. If you have the most amazing, cool idea for a game, there are two things that are almost certainly true. First, somebody else has probably already thought of it. And second, it represents a tiny little fraction of what's necessary to make a great game. If you look back through the history of games, one of the things you'll notice is that a really genuinely new type of game only emerges roughly once a decade. If you go back to the origin of shooters with games like Wolfenstein and Doom, that was in the early 90s. Shooters have been around for decades now, but at the time that those games were released, that was really the first time anybody had ever seen a thing called a shooter. In fact, they didn't even have a word for it at that point. That happens a lot. It's still true, and what that really means is that the greatness in a game doesn't come from a wholly original idea. It comes from an interpretation of something that may be a very familiar type of idea. And it really is true that the most derivative idea in games can often be surprising and delightful. It really comes down to the execution. And in fact, one of the things I do with my students is encourage them to take a very well-known game form, asteroids, for example, and see what they can do with it. Because invariably they will come up with something that other people wouldn't have come up with, and they'll make that game form their own. And it's a really great exercise. In fact, one of the best ways I know of to teach people who are trying to learn how to be game designers is to have them start by mimicking a really well-known game. And then finally, uh, games really become what they are in the last fifth of a project. And this has been true for a very long time. It's really true in almost any creative endeavor. If you're painting a great masterpiece, uh, the first half of the job is sketching and planning, and most of the rest of the job is just getting color laid in and getting light right. The polish and the iteration that happen on a game in the late stages of a project are really where the genius comes in. And that's why you'll notice in the background here I have an image from No Man's Sky. This is a great example of a game that really came into its own in the last 20%. The problem with No Man's Sky, of course, is that it shipped at about 80%, and a whole bunch of people were kind of salty about the result. But to Sean's credit and to the credit of the team, they stayed with it, and a year later, it's a pretty awesome game. So this is another one that's really near and dear to my heart. This is a thing that we as creators need to remember all the time. At the end of the day, it's their $50. And what I mean by that is people are giving you their money for a reason. And I think it's really important for us as creators to respect and recognize why they're doing that. So first off, your job as a game developer is not to beat the player. I actually had this debate with a game designer back in the late 80s. And I asked him, what do you think your job is? And he said, my job is to beat the player. I'm like, no, it's not at all. Your job is also not to instruct the player. I mean, we hope that some of the work we do will edify people, but the reality is we're not there to teach them. We're there to do something actually much more important and something they paid us to do. Your job is also not to show the player how smart you are. One of the things that I find to be really common among inexperienced game developers is they kind of fall in love with their spiffy ideas, and the result is that they get themselves off the target because they're too caught up in having fun playing with the cool thing they thought of. The reality is that's not interesting to a gamer, nor is technology. And so you can be building things as a game creator that are entertaining to you, but they're not why gamers bought your game. There's really only one reason that they'll give you their $50, and it's because you're entertaining them. And that's our job. Our job is to entertain. Our job is to surprise and delight. And I think it's critically important. This is a thing I pay attention to all the time, that we stay focused on that job and not all those other things. It doesn't mean we can't do things that instruct people or edify them or bring interesting new technology into play. But the reality is our job is to entertain our players. So this one is one that I think a lot of creatives don't really understand because it's kind of a strangely nuanced fact. But the fact is, as a creator, it is critically important that you pay attention to your audience and understand those people. It's also critically important that you not just do what they say. Many years ago, I had dinner with a guy named Andy Hollis, and Andy was the executive producer of the Jane's Combat Simulations line at Electronic Arts. And at the time, I was actually running Microsoft Simulator, Flight Simulator at Microsoft. And this is what he said to me. He said, we thought we'd win by asking the hardcore what they wanted. And that literally put us out of business. And that's exactly what happened. They found themselves in kind of a death spiral, chasing ever more finicky details that were beloved by a smaller and smaller group of enthusiasts. And the result was that their games got too expensive. They were too hard for normal people to play, and they just weren't that interesting to anybody. And I actually had a little bit of experience with that myself when I was producing Falcon 3. Um, the the game was a simulation of the F-16, which is as I'm sure you guys all know, a very capable uh, single seat fighter. Um, the the simulation that we built was was intended to be realistic, but we knew that we couldn't be completely focused on realism because honestly, realism isn't always that entertaining. Um, in the F-16, the real F-16, there are 22 different active radar modes on the radar systems on the aircraft. In Falcon 3, we used 3. That's for a reason. And so Andy kind of fell down that hole. And while he thought he was doing the right thing, the result was that his own audience kind of destroyed his line. And then some years later, I actually had dinner with Kathleen Kennedy. We worked together on a number of projects, and we were chatting about her experience um, producing The Sixth Sense, which is why that image is there on the screen. Kathy said something really interesting to me. She told me a story about how they got to what is now the canon ending in that film. And if you've seen the film, you know what I'm talking about. There is kind of a revisiting of moments through the story um, when the main character, Bruce Willis's character, um, spoiler alert, when he realizes he's actually dead. And when they when they screened the film for test audiences, the test audiences hated the ending, and they didn't really understand why. So they started asking, and what they finally realized was that that the audience understood the reveal. They got it. They got that Bruce Willis was dead, but the story ended too quickly. And the result was they didn't have time to kind of get through their emotional rebound when they hit the big reveal. And so they felt like they were kind of left hanging. And so they went back and they edited in that recap of events through the film that sort of led up to the realization that character was dead. And the result was a one of the most successful movies that Kathy Kennedy and Night Shyamalan ever did. The point in that is when your players, when your audience tell you something, you should listen. But what you shouldn't do is adopt what they tell you to do about it. That's up to you. You need to follow your own views. You need to be confident in the work you're doing, and don't, as Kathy says, ask permission. So this is actually another one that's kind of near and dear to my heart. I've been a game guy for a really long time. I've played a lot of games, board games, role-playing games, all of those things. And random numbers are a key part of most of those games in one form or another. But there's some things about random numbers as a designer you have to be really, really careful about. What it boils down to is an over reliance on random numbers, especially in computer or console-based games, is a really dangerous thing to do. And there are some observations I've made over the course of my career that I think kind of bear that out. First, random wins feel cheap, and it really is true. If you accomplish something in a game and your skill didn't really have that much to do with it, you just got lucky, you might be happy about it. You might be thrilled. But the reality is, it doesn't really feel like much of a victory. This is especially true in role playing games, where if you just happen to get a lucky die roll, something good happens, and you're like, well, okay, that's great, but it doesn't feel like you did anything. It's an event that happened, and the inverse is even more important. random losses feel unjust, and this is really a big deal. There's a phrase that's being used a lot these days called save scumming, and this is in reference to the exceedingly successful game Baldur's Gate 3, which is based on Dungeons and Dragons, which is very dependent on die rolls. And one of the things you'll see constantly in that game, unless people are playing in what they call honor mode, is that people will they'll do some kind of a die roll checking against an ability or whatever. And if it doesn't go their way, they'll go back, reload the game, and try it again. And um, if they fail, um, they they have this sense of unfairness, even if they know full well that the probability that they're going to succeed on this particular check is low. So what's wrong with that? Well, what's wrong with that is that it leaves a bad taste in their mouth, and they may not even know why. And as a designer, one of the things you don't want to do is put people in that position unless you do it intentionally. And there are cases where you might want to, but it's a thing you have to be really careful about as a designer. And then finally, this shouldn't surprise anybody. This is why things like loot boxes exist. This is why slot machines exist, which of course are simply loot boxes in a different package. Um, Random events that govern your so-called success in the game can create kind of weird emotional echoes, but the reality is random rewards, in other words, a reward that happens sometimes but not all the time when I engage in some kind of a random event, they feel great. This is why games like Diablo, action RPGs with a very high uh, pace of loot dropping, this is why those games feel so good to people. It's why they're so, frankly, addicting, because we as humans are basically programmed to turn over rocks to find grubs and other interesting things. And we love doing it. It's built into our DNA. And so random rewards are really compelling. They're really powerful. That's why loot boxes exist in games. And then this is just an observation that I think is important for anybody who has aspirations to work in the industry. And this is a thing that I learned through the course of my career, not really knowing I was going to learn it. As you move up in the food chain and do take command of bigger and bigger pieces of projects that you're working on, what you find is that you spend more and more of your time not doing the work. And this is for a couple of reasons, but here's one of them that I think is really, really interesting. And in fact, this gent, Russ Brown, was one of my team on the first game I ever worked on in the game biz. It was Pool of Radiance for the PC, and Russ was one of my programmers. And this is something he said to me while we were working on that project. He said, "Nobody thinks they're a programmer if they're not. Nobody thinks they're an artist if they're not. But everybody thinks they're a game designer." And that really is true. Everybody kind of has an opinion about game design, but they won't have that kind of opinion about coding, for example. Um, and this kind of connects to one of the things that I think a lot of people are surprised about when they move into the discipline of game design. You spend a lot of time convincing people about things. As a game designer, you will in fact spend about half your time explaining how stuff works and actually justifying the design. I'm not saying that's bad. I'm simply saying that's part of what we do as designers. It's not just about sitting down, thinking really hard, having a great idea, writing it down and saying, "Here, make this." That's not how it works. You spend a bunch of your time getting people on board, making sure they understand what you have in mind, why you believe what you believe about the way the game should work, and then helping them understand it well enough to actually do it. And as you move farther up in the food chain as a game director, so if you're responsible for an entire product, and this was certainly true for every project that I ran, you'll spend at least half your time making the money guys feel better. Now, if you think about it, that actually kind of makes sense, because if let's say you're an executive at Electronic Arts, and you're responsible for a budget of hundreds of millions of dollars in development funds. The last thing you want to think is that one of your executive producers or game directors is wasting that money, because maybe they're going to be held responsible, but so will you. And you want to make sure that things don't go off the rails and turn into a problem. There's a great story that people tell about James Cameron when he was working on Titanic. I'll tell it really fast because I know we're running a little low on time here. Cameron was down in Mexico with a giant tank of water and throwing movie stars in the water and shooting on location. And he was wildly over budget, wildly over time. And the president of Fox went down to Mexico to try to get Cameron back under control. And Cameron just simply refused to see him. He just never came out of his trailer when the president of Fox was around. And eventually the president of Fox went back to Los Angeles and the movie got done and it made $1 billion in the first year and everything was great, except for one thing. The president of Fox actually got fired. Why did he get fired? Because he, in the eyes of the board, endangered Fox because they spent so much money and it wasn't really certain that they were going to make that money back. So my point in that is it's completely reasonable for these guys to be a little terrified of the way you're using their money. And so you should expect as a creative to have to be able to convince those people that you're doing it right. So finally, I know this sounds terrible. Nobody cares. Well, what does that mean? Well, it's kind of good news and bad news. When I was at the Game Developers Conference in the late 80s for the first time, and in those days it was tiny. There was like maybe 150 people at the conference. I was in the lobby taking a break, and I sat down on this couch, and there was a line of potted plants behind me. And on the other side of those potted plants was another couch, and there were two guys talking. And this is what one of them said. He said, "Nobody cares how hard this is. All they care about is their damn game." Right. That's exactly right. Players don't really care that your job is hard. They don't really care if you're on time. They don't care about any of that stuff. They show up with a handful of money, they give it to you, and they expect to get something entertaining and rewarding in return. And that sounds like bad news, but it's also kind of liberating, because the reality is they don't really care how the sausage gets made. They just like the sausage. And then it's up to you to be smart about how you do that. And my final parting thought on this quote's been around for a long time, but it's one of my favorites. A delayed game is eventually good, but a rushed game is forever bad. Shigeru Miyamoto, for those of you who don't know. Say again? Sorry, I heard somebody talking. Shigeru Miyamoto is the head of development at Nintendo and has been for decades. He's one of the smartest people in the game biz, and he knows exactly what he's talking about. And the point here is that players also don't care when the game ships. They just want to make sure that it's great. So if you ever have aspirations to be a game developer, I encourage you to keep this in mind. And I'll point not just at Shigeru Miyamoto, but I'll also point at guys like Alex Seropian, who ran Bungie when Halo was being developed, at Mike Morhaime, who ran Blizzard when they were making StarCraft and World of Warcraft. Those guys knew this just as clearly as Miyamoto ever did. They know that you don't get to ship a game twice. You only ship it once. So with that, hopefully there was something interesting there for all of you guys. If you have questions, I have answers. Now, I think we're going to have to do this in chat because I don't know that I can hear you guys at the other end. But if anybody,
I'm going to ask over here and then see if there's any update.
So fire away. Or not.
Yeah, I was getting the question. One question is the favorite game you've ever worked on and why?
Favorite game I've ever worked on. Okay. So despite the fact that it was brutally hard, I guess I'd have to say Everything or Nothing. And the reason for that was that it was such a wild ride. We had a team that consisted of about 350 people spread across 3 locations in the United States, Canada, and in Europe. I got the opportunity to work with some of the best people I've ever known in their various disciplines, including music, including writing, and including game design. It was a hard ride for far too long, but it was a it was a gloriously great experience for me because that was probably the first time I had ever worked with A-list talent. And I'm not demeaning anybody I worked with prior to that point, but some of these people were amazing. My art director actually worked for Jim Cameron before he came to work for Electronic Arts. These people were astonishing, and it was an amazing experience. Would I do it again? Yeah, I probably would. Yeah, I probably would.
I'm just checking if there's. It's a really good question here. So, with the last quote that you had from Miyamoto was about delayed game is uh, delayed game's better than a rush game. Paraphrasing. The
Yeah.
question was translating that now to like the modern sort of ecosystem with DLCs, live service, and the
Yeah.
rest. Have companies now switched to balancing that a bit, where they do get
Yes.
to the 80% with the intention that maybe they rely a little bit more on DLCs, live service
Mhm.
updates versus the sort of ship it, done, and then release a large
Yeah.
patch later?
Yeah. It's a great question, and unfortunately, your observation is accurate. And I personally don't think that's a good thing for the industry at large. Digital distribution is amazing. There are a whole I could spend an hour talking about why digital distribution is so incredibly beneficial to the work we do. Not the least of which is it actually was the catalyst for the indie revolution, which is still going on and having a profound effect on the industry. But the reality is, it's really tempting to ship it before it's done so you can hit your date and then fix it, as they say in the film biz, fix it in post. It's a terrible idea. There are a whole bunch of reasons that's a bad idea, not the least of which is players know what you're doing. And if you put it out there, yeah, if you put it in early access or you call it a beta, I'm doing air quotes. You guys can't see that, but I'm doing air quotes when I say beta. You can kind of give yourself a pass, but the reality is nobody's buying it. And the number of launches that could have produced a better result, could have produced an outstanding result if they had simply gotten the work done, that number is enormous. Sean Murray and his team with No Man's Sky, to be completely honest, they kind of got lucky. The reason they were able to do what they did is because because Sony gave them money for the release of the PlayStation version of that game. Without that money, they wouldn't have had the funding to continue working on it and get it right. So think about how many projects didn't have the benefit of that particular lucky situation. It's huge. And I think in general, that that bad behavior among publishers and developers of shipping a game before it's ready, what that's done is it's made players wary. Early access was intended on, and I'm talking about Steam right now. Early access on Steam was intended to be a way for indie developers to connect with an audience and enlist the audience into the experience of evolving a game. It turned into a lazy way to kind of bilk players, and they're just not buying it anymore. So while I I love the fact that you can do continuous patches, and I love that you can do a live ops game if you're doing it for the right reasons. The reality is, if you use it as a crutch, you're not doing anybody any favors, and you're actually damaging the industry and your product. So, as a game guy, that's a thing I'll never do.
Cool. Thank you so much, Scott.
My
You
pleasure.
gotta run, so I'll let you go. But yeah, the
Okay.
1,000 people that are here are clapping and very appreciative.
Well, thanks you guys. And Christian, thank you for inviting me. This is super cool. And you guys have a great evening.
All right. And Scott, can you make me host again?
Yeah, actually, how do I do that? Let me see. How do I do it? I've never actually had to
If
do
you
this
right
before.
click, if you hover over my name, there's like three dots. And if you click the,
Uh,
oh no, sorry, I can just reclaim host.
oh, well, there you go.
That's a fun game.
Okay. All right, guys, be good.